It is June of the year 1098. The Crusading army has been on the road for nearly 2 years, since the summer of 1096, when, following the Pope's call to crusade, they departed from Western Europe and marched thousands of kilometers to Constantinople, which was then the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. They were there at the invitation of the emperor himself, whose letter to the Pope had begun the entire Crusade expedition. And these Western knights had answered the call to assist the Eastern Roman Emperor and liberate Eastern Christians from the control of the Seljuk Turks, who had rapidly expanded westwards, taking over territory that had belonged to the emperor, and with it ruling over the people who lived in those cities and territories. So it's been a long road, and it has had many dark hours, but perhaps none is as dark as this one. The Crusading army has been arrayed outside the walls of the city of Antioch for nearly 8 months. They've been there since October of 1097. They've stayed through an entire winter of deprivation and near starvation before finally breaking into the city in the month of June 1098. But scarcely had they scaled the walls and completed their pillaging of the city itself when another army arrived outside the gates, surrounding the city of Antioch with the Crusaders trapped inside. They have very little food, they are exhausted, and they are far outnumbered by the enemy at the gates. Will there be a way out of Antioch? The odds looked extremely small. You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is the 3rd episode in a series on the First Crusade. But before I get started, I want to pause and say a note of thanks to the community that supports this podcast on Patreon, and especially to the following individuals who are supporting the podcast at the highest level. They are Richard Hubner, Kenneth Jones, Tim Williams, Anthony Farnbach, Richard Kane, Gordon Carl, and Agnes Viner. I'm very grateful to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon, and if you're interested in getting access to even more history content, including live conversations after the release of each new episode, head over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert and check it out. As the Crusaders sat inside the walls of Antioch, it seemed that their hour of destruction had finally arrived. In the last episode, we saw they had overcome incredible odds, not once but repeatedly. As they had surrounded Antioch from the outside, they had been faced with multiple enemy armies that had come in attempting to relieve the inhabitants of Antioch, only to be beaten back by the Crusaders, whose numbers were far fewer than those in the Seljuk Turkish armies that opposed them. So already they had had several narrow escapes, and having finally succeeded in getting into the walls of Antioch itself, they weren't even able to enjoy this hard-fought victory because the very next day, the beginnings of a new Seljuk Turkish army had started to arrive outside the city walls. So the Crusaders are stuck inside. They had very little food. They didn't find much inside the city because it had been under siege for 8 months. And now, to make matters even worse, they were surrounded by an enemy army outside the walls. So they have nowhere to go, nowhere to get food from, and no way out of the city. And then a miracle happened. At least that's how it seemed to some of these beleaguered soldiers. So there was a peasant by the name of Peter Bartholomew, and he approached 2 of the Crusader leaders, a southern French nobleman by the name of Count Raymond of Toulouse, and Bishop Adhemar, who was obviously a churchman, but someone who was of fairly high rank and had a leadership position amongst the Council of Crusader leaders. Peter Bartholomew, by contrast, is a peasant. So he's serving one of the knights in the Crusading army, but he seeks a meeting with these 2 very important Crusade leaders, and he says, "I've had some visions. I've had these dreams or visions in which I see these two holy men, and they've been giving me messages. And they say that a piece of the Holy Lance is buried right here in Antioch. And if we get a hold of this lance, victory is certain. So what is the Holy Lance? The Holy Lance refers to an object that actually had contact with the body of Jesus. And it's referred to in the New Testament. When Jesus is crucified, there's a Roman centurion who comes and jams a spear into his side. So this object is now referred to as the Holy Lance. And many Christians in the medieval period would have believed that it had some special, spiritual, almost magical power. That by virtue of making contact with the body of Jesus himself, it had some residual magical properties. And so Peter Bartholomew is saying, listen, there's a piece of this very object, this extremely holy, extremely powerful object buried right here at Antioch. And the holy men in my dreams tell me that he who possesses the Holy Lance shall not be overcome. So one of the two men that Peter Bartholomew was talking to was immediately skeptical. And if you had to guess between Bishop Adhemar and Count Raymond of Toulouse, who is skeptical, you might not have picked the bishop. But that is in fact the correct answer. It was Bishop Adhemar who raised a dubious eyebrow at the account of this enthusiastic peasant and said, "Really?" And it wasn't because Bishop Adhemar was a particularly skeptical fellow. He was in the position of many medieval churchmen at the time who were regularly faced with claims of miracles and holy objects that common people brought to them and wanted to have recognized or made official. And the sheer volume of these requests in the Middle Ages forced many of them to be a little bit dubious and to consider who was the source, are there witnesses, how can we verify that this is actually something that happened. So Bishop Adhemar was taking perhaps a familiar position of doubt and didn't immediately accept what Peter Bartholomew was saying. But in addition to his natural caution, Bishop Adhemar knew something else, which was that the Holy Lance had already been found. Actually, an object that was widely accepted to be the Holy Lance was already in the collection of the Emperor of Eastern Rome in his collection in Constantinople. So what is this Holy Lance that you're telling us is here? As a churchman, he already knew where the Holy Lance was. It had been found. So he had additional reasons to be a little bit dubious. Count Raymond of Toulouse, by contrast, enthusiastically accepted this story and declared that he would send his men immediately to go to the place that Peter Bartholomew indicated and begin to dig. So we have Crusader sources that refer to the finding of the Holy Lance, some of them who were embedded with the Crusades at the time and are writing about things they witnessed or saw firsthand. And we also have some sources from Muslim historians writing not long after. And one of them, a man named Ibn al-Athir, has a very different version of this event. Writing some decades later, Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir says the following: "There was also a holy man who had great influence over the Crusaders, a man of low cunning who proclaimed that the Messiah had a lance buried in the church in Antioch. And if you find it, you will be victorious, and if you fail, you will surely die," he said. Before saying this, the holy man had buried a lance in a certain spot and concealed all trace of it. He exhorted them to fast and repent for 3 days, and on the 4th day he led them all to the spot with their soldiers and workmen, who dug everywhere and found the lance as he had told them. Whereupon he cried, "Rejoice, for victory is secure." Unquote. Now, it's very interesting because Ibn al-Athir's account is almost identical to the Crusader accounts. They all agree that Peter Bartholomew told the army that they needed to fast and pray for 3 days to purify their souls before they attempted to locate this relic. So that checks out. But the difference is the cynicism. Ibn al-Athir says, this was basically a low trick, that this guy conceals the lance, himself and then comes to them with this talk of magical visions and messages and holy powers, when in fact the guy buried a fake relic himself and then led the army there to find it. And perhaps Bishop Adhemar would have agreed with the Muslim sources on this, but Count Raymond of Toulouse was happy to accept the story, and so were many other crusaders, out of desperation if nothing else. Remember that these men are basically staring down the barrel of annihilation. They don't see a way out of Antioch. They are starving. They are desperate. They are outnumbered. So if they could find some object that promised them victory against the odds, which would lift their spirits a little bit, now would be a great time for that to happen. And many of them embraced the story because it was a sliver of desperately needed hope. Now, while finding the Holy Lance was a huge boost to morale, it didn't send the Crusaders immediately galloping out of the gates to face the Seljuk Turks. In fact, 2 painful weeks passed before they did anything. And one of the reasons for this was that they were desperately hoping that imperial forces sent by Emperor Alexius Comnenus, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, were on the way to Antioch to relieve them. If they could get some help, some military reinforcement, that would dramatically improve their odds of survival in the battle ahead. So they were hanging on, slowly eating whatever bits of edible matter that they could find, hoping that this army was going to arrive. Unfortunately, that army wasn't going to arrive. And that's because some days before, during the privations and desperation of the siege itself, some knights had deserted. They'd snuck away in the middle of the night, run off, and 2 of these knights had encountered Emperor Alexius Comnenus and his army, who were riding towards Antioch, and said, "Don't go there. It's hopeless. The Crusaders are trapped inside the city. They've probably all been overrun by the Turks by now and slaughtered. There's nothing in Antioch but death and defeat." And when the emperor heard that, he thought, well, there's not much point me going to Antioch if that's what the scene is. In fact, I should turn around and head back toward Constantinople because I don't want to intercept a victorious Turkish army emerging from Antioch. What's the point? It's all risk and no reward. So the emperor turns around the army that the Crusaders so desperately were hoping for and marches back the other way. So that's the reason that he never arrives. So 2 painful weeks go by before they begin to realize that this is probably not going to happen. The next attempt they make is to send a messenger to the commander of the enemy army that has encircled Antioch. So the Crusaders send out a messenger to meet that commander, a guy named Kerboga. So he's in charge of this very large army, and they come to him and they say, "Listen, let's make a deal. How about we hand over Antioch to you? We'll just give it up if you will allow us safe passage out of here. So if you promise not to kill us, we will all leave the city. We won't fight you. You can have Antioch. Just let us leave on our way." And Kerboga laughs and he says, "Well, why would I agree to something like that? The cards are all in my favor. The only way out for you is to fight your way out. You're not getting free passage out of anywhere." So at this point, the Crusaders have exhausted every idea they can think of. The emperor's not coming. There's no possible deal with the enemy army. They're stuck inside the city, starving, and every day that goes by gets worse. So we have stories of these Crusaders eating their horses. Some of them are bleeding their horses on a regular basis. So making incisions, allowing the horse to bleed, and drinking that blood, which would allow the horse to keep on living and producing more blood. But the Crusaders drinking that were trying to survive on this. So absolutely desperate conditions that they're in. And with no more food, no way of acquiring more food, every day that goes on makes every man weaker. So finally they say, you know what, if we're going to die, better that we go down fighting than sit here and just weaken and surrender to starvation day by day. So the Council of Crusade leaders meets together and they concoct a plan. Or rather, they put Bohemond in charge of concocting a plan. Now, if you've been listening to the last few episodes, you'll know that Bohemond was perhaps the man with the greatest amount of military experience. Someone who was now in his early 40s, but had spent the last 2 decades of his life on campaigns basically every single year. So there was perhaps no better qualified man in terms of figuring out what was the best strategy and how best to organize the men, the resources, and the terrain he had available to increase their odds. And Bohemond puts his strategic intelligence to work, and he comes up with a plan. Antioch is a city with 6 different gates, which makes it a little bit difficult for the attacking army of Seljuk Turks because they have to spread out and encircle the entire perimeter of the city, covering off all 6 gates. What that means is there isn't a huge amount of troop density at any particular gate. So Bohemond's first decision is which gate is the best one to send the Crusaders charging out of, which one gives them the best chance of surviving their encounter with the section of the Seljuk army that is waiting right outside. To make matters even more challenging, one of the Crusaders' strategic advantages doesn't exist anymore. So far, in their encounters with the Seljuk Turkish army, the Crusaders have done well because they've been armored cavalry. This doesn't mean that everyone in the army was a mounted knight, but it means that their armies had a significant component of fighters who were men wearing very significant armor, riding horses. This made them a little more impervious to the sudden arrow attacks that Seljuk armies typically used to devastate opposing forces before they closed in for the kill. At this point, though, the Crusaders don't really have any horses left. A tiny handful of very, very weakened animals who've been bled on a regular basis for the last several weeks. So this advantage that they formerly had is pretty much gone. They're going to be functioning essentially as infantry. In preparation for the day of battle, Bohemond divided the troops into several divisions, each with very clear instructions for when and how they were going to maneuver. On June 28th, 1098, early in the morning, priests line the walls of the city of Antioch, chanting and praying, trying to propitiate God for success against overwhelming odds. The Crusaders' shock attack began with a charge, a division of archers maneuvering out of the gate as quickly as they could and engaging the Seljuk army that was sitting on the other side of the bridge, which they had to cross. One of the things that they had in their favor here was that the Seljuks were not expecting them to attack. And why would they? The Crusading army was vastly outnumbered. It would have seemed like a suicide mission. So there's even a story that Kerboga, the commander, was sitting in his tent playing chess when he heard news that suddenly there was action and the Crusaders were coming out of the city, and he thought, what? Really? This can't be true. Who would leave the fortifications of a walled city and throw themselves into the arms of a much larger waiting army? So he's so dubious when he hears this report that he doesn't react immediately. So the first division of archers are out of the gate and they're engaging the section of the Turkish army that is across from them who are not expecting them. As soon as they come out, firing arrows as rapidly as they can, they move to one side and they are providing room here for the next divisions to come out of the gate, across the bridge, and into position. So each division crosses the bridge and fans out to one side, creating more space for the rest of the Crusaders to follow. Partly because of the sheer surprise and the ferocity with which the Crusaders engage, they manage to break Turkish lines at this part in front of the gate, and the Turks break in confusion, they start running in retreat, and as they do so, they begin to run into other Turks who are coming to reinforce that position. So now you've got men moving in 2 opposite directions, they're causing confusion and disorder in their own lines, and this makes it much easier for the Crusaders to follow and start cutting down in every direction. The Crusaders are also very successful in protecting their own rear guard, and this was something that Bohemond had very clearly indicated was mandatory. So there's a group of Crusaders that are designated for this purpose exactly, and they pay a very high cost. A lot of them die, but their job is to defend the backsides of the army from Seljuks who could circle around and start cutting them down from behind. Partly because of the shock of the Crusader attack, and surely due to the ferocity with which they pursued the fleeing Turks, the Crusaders were able to rout the Turkish lines. The army just splintered, broke, and began to retreat. And once that maneuver happened, this kind of panic and disorder quickly spreads. Word travels down around the lines of other men spread out along the wall that it's a retreat, we're moving off, it's a disaster. And so the Turkish army is unable to regroup, consolidate, and effectively deal with the Crusaders. But even with all of that said, this is one of the most shocking battlefield outcomes I have ever read. By every logical measure, the Crusaders should have been massacred at this point. Think about it. They are a much smaller number of men. They've been malnourished and on the brink of starvation for months. Many of them have died due to disease, and some of them who aren't dead are weakened by illness. So these guys have lost their horses, they've lost their health, they've lost much of their strength. They're facing an army that is vastly larger, that is well slept, well fed, and full of energy. How is it possible that they didn't lose? One of the factors has to be the fact that the Crusaders had nothing to lose. They were absolutely desperate. If they didn't survive this battle, they were all dead men anyway. So the determination that would have created would have been everything they could muster. The Turks, on the other hand, if this battle didn't go well, they could always retreat, regroup, and fight another day. They didn't have all of their stakes in this game. They could afford to think about retreat. The Crusaders did not have that as an option. So that has to be something that's on the table. But there's another factor that the Crusaders couldn't have known about, which definitely had a remarkable effect on the outcome of this engagement. And that was the standing of Kerboga himself, this general of the Seljuk Turkish army. He was very disliked by his men. So, unlike the Crusaders, who've been fighting together for months, if not a couple of years now, this army has been hastily assembled of divisions of men who've come from different areas under different sort of lieutenants or sub-commanders. So they don't have the group cohesion that the Crusaders do. In addition to that, many of the sub-commanders under Kerboga resent him personally. They say that he's arrogant, that he's treated them with contempt, that he's humiliated them. He's extremely unpopular. To make matters worse, under Kerboga's command, this large Seljuk Turkish army was diverted to another city, Edessa, for some 3 weeks because Kerboga decided that it was a good idea to go besiege that city and deal with that problem before they got to Antioch. Because he made that decision, by the time the Seljuks get to Antioch, the Crusaders are already inside. They've sacked the city and they've massacred many of the inhabitants. So surely some of the commanders and men in that army were seething with resentment, saying, if only that idiot of a commander that we had marched us here directly, we could have prevented this disaster. But no, he had his own ideas. He wouldn't listen to anybody. So he's a hated man in some quarters. And we have some sources that suggest that some of the sub-commanders had already made up their minds to cut and run during the battle. That this might have been an act of revenge, like, oh, okay, you think that you're the high and mighty commander and that everyone does what you say, and this is going to be a great battlefield glory that's going to enhance your prestige? Maybe not. Maybe if we leave you on the battlefield and make it a disaster for you, then you're going to suffer some shame and humiliation. So it seems that there were significant elements in the Seljuk Turkish army that had already decided this battle wasn't going to go well just because they hated their commander. The Crusaders couldn't have known this, of course, but it definitely goes a long way to explaining why such a larger army with such better resources would have cut and run under these circumstances. But because these factors were hidden from the Crusaders, they attributed their success to divine intervention, to the hand of God. And Raymond of Toulouse, of course, was quick to point to the Holy Lance, which he had carried into battle as a magic talisman object that had ensured their victory. Other Crusaders reported that they had seen visions of white horses coming down from the sky with Saint Michael and the archangels fighting on their behalf. So there were various interpretations, but it was hardly surprising that they would have regarded their victory here as miraculous, because in many ways it really was. So, having managed to survive Antioch, having managed to overcome a third, much larger enemy army, the Crusaders now saw the road to Jerusalem clear in front of them. Only another 500 kilometers, and they could reach the city that had been the endpoint of this quest, which had already taken them 2 very hard years. The Crusaders, of course, immediately take advantage of the resources that have been abandoned by the retreating Turkish army. So they close in on the abandoned Seljuk camp, and they help themselves to much-needed horses, food, water, wine, valuables that they can use to buy food down the road. And any women that they find in the tents, the Crusader sources say, are immediately killed with a spear to the stomach. So evidently, the Seljuks had brought some friends along as traveling companions, perhaps to help celebrate what they thought inevitable victory. But all of these women met an immediate end when they were found by the Crusading army. After settling down to the first decent meal in months and an enormous sense of relief at their most unlikely survival, many of the Crusaders thought that they would soon be marching to Jerusalem. But that road was going to take a lot longer than anybody thought. First of all, cracks and divisions were beginning to open immediately amongst the Crusader leaders now that they had control of Antioch. Furthermore, the hottest part of the summer was about to hit. This was the very end of June. Remember where we are. We're looking at Syria, Turkey, and when you get toward Jerusalem, Palestine itself. These are not temperate places to be in July and August. So there were some Crusaders who thought, maybe we should stay under cover, stay inside a sheltered place for a little while, rest up and eat, and wait for the worst part of the heat to pass before we start marching over hostile terrain and add not just enemy arrows, but dehydration and heat exhaustion to the list of our problems. After all, it's a poor time to be marching across a landscape in baking heat wearing metal armor. One of the things that began to develop in the immediate aftermath of Antioch was resentment against Emperor Alexius Comnenus back in Constantinople. And there were 3 major factors for this. First of all, there had been so much famine that the Crusaders had experienced during the 6-month siege from October to June. And they held the emperor somewhat responsible for this, because one of the terms of their agreement with him was that they were coming into his territory to help him reclaim cities like Antioch that he had lost to the Seljuk Turks. But in exchange, he was supposed to supply them with provisions. And so the fact that they had been so near death due to a lack of food was something that many men pointed with resentment directly back at the emperor and said he should have done something about this. Number 2, there was the fact that, as we saw in episode 2, one of the emperor's generals, who had been stationed with the Crusaders, had left during the siege of Antioch as the Crusaders had surrounded the city and said, I'm going to go back and talk to the emperor and try to arrange for some food and reinforcements. That general had never been seen again. So to many of the Crusaders, it seemed that he had betrayed them. Now, it's important to note that appearances are not necessarily reality. So we saw in one of our previous episodes that while the Crusaders were suffering hunger outside of Antioch, there was a shipment of supplies that arrived by sea, which relieved them. Now, many of the Crusaders didn't think that this came from the emperor, and some of them said that Bohemond arranged it. This is probably a rumor that Bohemond himself originated or was happy to spread. Bohemond had his own reasons for wanting to blacken the emperor's name, as we shall see very shortly. But food had arrived at a critical point and had prevented a number of the Crusaders from dying. The question was where it came from. So it wasn't necessarily obvious to everyone that perhaps that general who left to go talk to the emperor had something to do with it. Many of the Crusaders didn't put these two together, especially when Bohemond was busy taking the credit. So we have two factors so far. The emperor's not apparently sending enough provisions. His general rides off to get help and doesn't return. And then we have the third factor, which is that no relief army from the emperor arrives when the Crusaders are stuck inside Antioch, when they are at their most desperate. But as you know, which the Crusaders at this point didn't, the emperor had been on his way with an army. And he'd turned it around when some deserting Crusader knights told him that it was a lost cause. But once again, to the army of Crusaders at Antioch at this moment, none of this was obvious. So they had a story that was beginning to develop. A story in which the emperor was treacherous, had lied to them, had abandoned them, and had greatly increased their suffering as a result. So the reason I mention all of this is that it's necessary to understand what's in the mind of these Crusaders and their leaders to explain what's about to happen next. So Bohemond, the military genius of this expedition and the one who's masterminded the strategy that allowed them to survive this most recent battle and several previous ones, has a meeting with the other nobles who are in charge of different divisions of the Crusaders. And he says, I want Antioch to be mine. And remember, before we scaled the walls, which we talk about in episode 2, we made a deal. Whoever gets inside the city first, it shall be his property. And I got my guys in first. I scaled the walls. I sounded the trumpets. I put my banner up on the wall. So Antioch is mine by right. And the other Crusaders, including Count Raymond of Toulouse, the carrier of the Holy Lance, said, wait, not so fast. I mean, you get to hold part of Antioch now, but we all swore oaths of fealty to Emperor Alexius Comnenus when we arrived in Constantinople at the beginning of this expedition, and we swore that any of his cities that we took, we would hand back to him. Antioch is one of those cities. So we're honor-bound. We're bound by oath to hand it back to the emperor at some point. And Bohemond says, our oaths are null and void because the emperor didn't keep up his end of the deal. Look, he didn't send us food. He didn't send us troops. He's left us on our own. He didn't seem to care if we lived or died. So we won Antioch with our own valor and our own risk. Therefore we, by which he meant I, should be able to keep it. So this tension emerges, and Raymond of Toulouse and his men are occupying some strategic points of Antioch. Bohemond and his men have others, and different other divisions of the Crusading army are spread out in different places. But the major controversy is between Bohemond and Raymond. Raymond of Toulouse says, we have to do what we swore to the emperor we would do. And Bohemond says, no, I should be the ruler of Antioch. It's mine. This is my reward for taking most of the risks and for getting you all inside the city gates. One of the problems that had been brewing under the surface of this entire crusading expedition, basically since they'd arrived in Constantinople back in 1096, and now it's 1098, is that there is no one clear authority that has command of the entire crusading army. It was supposed to be Emperor Alexius Comnenus. That's what the Crusaders all thought when they arrived. But the emperor was unable to travel very far away from Constantinople or stay away from that city for an extended period, like leading an army on campaign, because of the risk of rebellion and overthrow that he was running if he left that city. He had very good reasons to believe that there were people actively trying to unseat him and take his throne. So he was unable to leave Constantinople for very long. That means he didn't ride with the army. So all of these crusaders, they kind of have nobles and princes who are in charge of separate divisions of the army. Bohemond is one of these guys. Raymond of Toulouse is another. There are multiple other nobles. Bohemond has a nephew, by the way, called Tancred, another Norman. He's got his own group of men. All of these guys have a very high opinion of themselves. None of them is used to taking orders, so they've been functioning essentially as a rule by council so far, where the leaders of these different divisions in the army get together and as a committee or a group, they try to decide what they should do next. But right now, that's beginning to break down as this really sharp division emerges between Bohemond and Raymond. And they're forcing the other division leaders to take sides. Are they going to support Raymond's position and say, we have to hand this back to the emperor? Or are they going to take Bohemond's position, which could benefit each of them in turn? Because if you're going to take Bohemond's position, you're saying, we have a right to the spoils that we have won at the cost of our own blood and risk. So if Bohemond can take this city, maybe some of the other Crusader leaders can take other cities for themselves. So there are reasons to side with Bohemond as well. Also, the last 6 months of the siege of Antioch had been absolutely ruinous for a large number of the men in the Crusader army. I've been talking a lot about nobles, but they weren't an army composed entirely of nobles. Nobles were valuable because they brought their own divisions of men who served under them, guys who were foot soldiers and squires and infantrymen. So for these guys, who are not aristocrats and don't have family money, they've spent everything they've had just trying to survive, buying tiny amounts of food at increasingly exorbitant prices, as there's less and less of that to go around. So at this point, many of them are penniless, they've been starving for quite some time, and what happens at this point is a massive realignment. So some of the nobles who still have extra money begin to offer terms and say, okay, anyone who needs to be paid, anyone who wants to change bosses can come and serve under me, and I'll offer wages and you can join my contingent. You can think of these as private armies, each of them under the head of one of these ranking noblemen. So the ones that have more money, and Raymond of Toulouse is definitely one of these guys, begin to offer deals to attract more of the rank and file under their direct control. So there's this kind of jockeying that's going on as well. And alliances are shifting, and men-at-arms and infantrymen are beginning to change which noble they're going to serve under. And some of these nobles, with their newly inflated group of men, use this summer pause at Antioch to ride off into the countryside and see if they can acquire some additional wealth or resources for themselves. One of these guys was a knight called Raymond Pelé, who rides off with his band of followers to take some fortresses in the area. And the reason he wants to do that is if he can hold these fortresses, he can use them as staging bases to send his guys out on raids and extract protection payments from locals in the area. So he's already heading off to find a way to enrich himself and his followers while the army is sitting on pause in Antioch. Some of these fortresses were in the hands of local Syrian Christians. And remember, there have been Christians in Syria for a very long time, far longer than there have been in Western Europe. When we're looking at Syria and Egypt, and the closer you get to Jerusalem, you're looking at the very birth country of Christianity. So the very first Christian communities are here, and in 1095, there are still Syrian Christians in these hills. So some of them are in control of some of these fortresses or towns, and they sort of surrender to Raymond Pelé without much of a fight. Other fortresses are held by Muslims. One of the followers of Raymond Pelé writes as follows, quote, "His men captured all the peasants of the district and killed those who would not be christened," meaning baptized. "But those who preferred to acknowledge Christ, they spared." So this incident reveals that some of the Crusaders, like Raymond Pelé, were perfectly happy to try and convert people at sword point and kill them if they refused to acknowledge Christianity. So as all of this is going on, raiding missions out into the hills, realignment of which nobles men are serving under, the standoff between Bohemond and Raymond of Toulouse drags on. And it's beginning to cause enormous frustration for the rest of the Crusading army because they want to have some sense of when they're moving on, what the plan is, how they're going to get to Jerusalem. And it seems that these two nobles are just having a petty dispute over who's going to control what. And many of the Crusaders have no interest in this. So eventually, because it seems they're going to be happy to quarrel with each other indefinitely, the men say, we will actually destroy the city of Antioch with our own hands. If you guys are going to sit here and fight about this city, we'll give you nothing to fight about. We'll destroy the city so there's nothing to hold if you continue. And so there are actually accounts of regular soldiers starting to take apart sections of the city wall. And when Raymond's men, the supervisors, walk by and see them, they're rebuked, and the guys are like, oh yeah, sorry. And as soon as these officers go by, they go right back to destroying parts of the wall. And this is an act of resistance. It's a way of saying, TikTok, you better get yourself sorted, because otherwise there's not going to be any city left worth having. And it's an interesting moment that you'd think that, men who've paid such a high price to take this city are actually willing to destroy it themselves because they're so angry at the quarrel that's going on. So finally, Raymond of Toulouse realizes that he'd better make a decision. He's not going to win in Antioch. So he takes the men who follow him, his personal division of the army, and he rides out of Antioch towards a nearby town called Marat. Marat is on the route to Jerusalem, so Raymond and his men are actually starting to make progress in the right direction. And Bohemond thinks, oh no, we can't let Raymond get an advantage, so he takes some of his men. He leaves some of them behind, of course, to maintain control of the city, but Bohemond takes some of his men and rides off in hot pursuit of Raymond and his division because he wants a piece of whatever's going to happen at Marat. He doesn't want Raymond to get anything that he doesn't have as well. Now we have to pause in all of this to introduce a new player in the game. And these are the Fatimids. So who are the Fatimids? Why do they matter? Okay, up to this point, the Crusading army has been fighting against the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks are Muslims, but they are relatively recent arrivals in these lands. They've only recently taken over Antioch and Jerusalem and so on. So the Seljuks have been causing a lot of upheaval. They've been eating up chunks of territory that used to be under the control of Emperor Alexius Comnenus, but not only under his control. They've also been eating up territory that used to be under the control of other Muslims, the Fatimids. So the Fatimids have their capital in Cairo, Egypt, at this point. And they have had a diplomatic relationship with Emperor Alexius Comnenus. In fact, when the Crusading army arrives, Emperor Alexius Comnenus tells the Fatimids, yes, I've invited these Westerners in here, and they're going to help me reclaim some of my lost territory. I'm going to get back the lands that were mine, which the Seljuks have taken. And the Fatimids say, great, that's fantastic. If we can put the Seljuks in check, then we, the Fatimids, can start taking back land that we lost to the Seljuks. So, under the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the Fatimids greet the arrival of the Crusaders with cheerfulness, and they even send a delegation to the Crusaders when they're outside the walls of Antioch besieging it, bringing gifts. And, having a friendly conversation. They want to have a diplomatic talk. So the Fatimids are Muslims, but they are happy to see the Crusaders, and they are the enemies of the Seljuks. Okay, so not all Muslims in the region are fighting on the same side. Now, there are a number of differences between the Fatimids and the Seljuks. First of all, the Fatimids are a Shia dynasty. So in the Muslim world, there are Shia and Sunni. Sunni is by far the majority of Muslims in the world, but the Shia have been around essentially since the earliest days of Islam, and they are distinct. And the Shia and the Sunni, they do not get along well with each other in any case. So the Fatimids are Shia, They're not particularly friendly with the Sunni Seljuk Muslims. Now, while Emperor Alexius Comnenus has told the Fatimids that the Crusaders are just in town to help him retake land that was his, he's not telling the complete truth. Because, as you know, the Crusaders are also there to take Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a central part of the call to crusade that went out in Western Europe. The Pope used it heavily in his messaging when he tried to galvanize this military expedition, and it looms large in the imagination of these crusaders. They're very fixated on Jerusalem, and in many ways they see the entire crusade as an armed pilgrimage. Christians have been going to Jerusalem for centuries from Western Europe. It's been a site of pilgrimage forever. And so the Crusaders all know about this. They know people who've done this pilgrimage. Now they're making their way to Jerusalem. In their minds, it's a holy place. But Jerusalem wasn't part of Emperor Alexius Comnenus' territory. The Eastern Roman Empire lost control of Jerusalem to Muslims back in 638. Okay, that's more than 4 centuries ago. We're now in 1098. So this emperor, Alexius Comnenus, had never controlled Jerusalem. So when he tells the Fatimids, yeah, the Crusaders are just here to help me take back my land that's recently been taken by the Seljuks, he's lying. He's told the Crusaders that they can take Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was under Muslim control all this time. And Christians had been coming as pilgrims for the last 4 centuries. But you're going, wait. Didn't the Crusade call say that Christians weren't able to go to Jerusalem and that Muslims were doing terrible, atrocious, barbarous things to them? Yes and no. That is what they said. That is what the Pope said. That is what the Emperor said. The Muslims who were causing those problems were the Seljuk Turks, who had very, very recently arrived in Jerusalem. The Muslims who had controlled Jerusalem for the last 4 centuries hadn't really been a problem. That's why there had been this pilgrimage route that had been going on forever. So yes, there were Muslims causing problems. Those were the ones that the Crusaders were supposed to go in there and deal with. But it wasn't as though the Muslims had just taken Jerusalem and it was newly in Muslim hands. That is incorrect. So the reality of Jerusalem was that there were Christians living in that city, as there had been since the earliest days of Christianity, and there were Muslims living in that city as they had for the last 4 centuries, and Christians from Western Europe had been making pilgrimages to that city for several centuries while it had been under Muslim control. So the problems that had arisen with violence against pilgrims were very, very recent. Now you might be thinking, why didn't the Fatimids join forces with the Seljuks against these Western Christian knights? I mean, why didn't the forces of Islam all fight on the same side? Well, if you think that the Shia Fatimids and the Sunni Turks should be on the same side just because they're Muslims, maybe think about Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. They weren't on the same side just because they were both Christians. They were 2 very different types of Christians, and they regarded each other as heretical. And of course, there were geopolitical and other concerns as well embedded in that conflict, just as there are here. So reducing it simply to anyone who's Muslim is on one side and anyone who is Christian is on the other, it's not that simple. So at this point in the story, the Fatimids have thought of the Crusaders as a welcome introduction to the politics of the region, something that's going to benefit them, and they're consequently quite concerned when they begin to see the Crusaders start making their way out of Antioch and heading in the direction of Jerusalem, because now they're crossing a line. They're crossing out of territory that had been part of the Eastern Roman Empire and into territory that had traditionally been under Fatimid control, including Jerusalem. And the Fatimids themselves have just taken Jerusalem back from the Seljuks. So while the Crusaders were busy fighting in Antioch and then quarreling amongst themselves for some weeks, in August of 1098, the Fatimids have sent their own army into Jerusalem and kicked out the Seljuk Turks. So as the Fatimids are now sitting inside Jerusalem, which they've just reclaimed from the Seljuks, and they begin to look at the crusading army start crossing the line into their territory and head towards Jerusalem, they're saying, wait a second, what's going on? This is not what the emperor told us was going to happen here. So the Crusaders are heading in the direction of Jerusalem, but they're doing so at a very leisurely pace. And there are two reasons for this. First of all, they need to resupply and recalorify themselves. It takes more than a day or two of good eating to restore starving men to full fighting strength. So these guys need to have a not too strenuous progress forward with lots of time for resting and eating and rebuilding themselves, not to mention acquiring other supplies and horses and things along the way. So that's what they're doing. They're making this sort of slow progress, very, very slow. They're going to take weeks or months to make the distance that they could have covered much faster if they just wanted to get to Jerusalem directly. And this is where some of the most disturbing stories about the First Crusade are going to unfold. So the Crusaders reach a prosperous town called Marat, and different sources refer to it as Marat al-Numan or al-Marah. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to call it Marat, but if you are reading about this episode, you may see it under those different variations of the name. And they reach Marat in late November. So again, this tells you that they were hanging out in Antioch all summer and most of the early fall. So by the time they get to Marat, it's really only 3 days march from Antioch, which means they didn't leave Antioch until late November. That's why guys were so upset that they were willing to tear down the walls, is that they were sick and tired of sitting in that city as the nobles were quarreling. So here we are, late November, leisurely slow march, they get to Marat. The crusading army surrounds this city, they put it under siege, and unfortunately the defenders of this area, they don't have an army. They haven't been fortifying themselves waiting for an attack. They didn't expect one, actually. And because they are only 3 days march from Antioch, they all know what happened over there. Those are essentially their neighbors. So they regard with dread the arrival of this army of what they regard as savage foreigners. And they only have kind of a civilian defense force of volunteers. So there are stories of men in Marat throwing beehives down from the walls against attacking Crusaders, but it didn't last very long. The siege ends on December 11th, 1098, so we're looking at maybe 2 weeks to 10 days of how long this is going to take. The Crusaders break into the city and, as usual, they massacre the inhabitants. So the accounts of this town are that bodies were piled high in the streets so that you could barely make your way through the lanes without stepping on corpses. So it was a ghastly sight. And once again, Bohemond and Raymond of Toulouse are jockeying for an advantageous position in this town. So the whole purpose for Bohemond being in this city is to take sections of it and then say, I'm going to hold on to these. Oh, Raymond of Toulouse, you would like to have them? Well, you can have my sections of Marat if you surrender to me your sections of Antioch. So Bohemond is actually just here to seize bits of territory that he can use as bargaining chips in his ongoing struggle with Raymond of Toulouse. Meanwhile, Raymond is trying to increase his own status and profile amongst the Crusaders because he wants to get himself acknowledged as the leader of the entire crusade. So up to this point, you might have been thinking that Raymond is this very noble guy who just wants to keep his oath to the emperor and so on, but many historians think that Raymond's insistence on maintaining the oath was just an easy way to take a defensible position against Bohemond's ambition, because Raymond has ambitions of his own. And he's one of the wealthiest nobles, he's one of the highest-born nobles, and so he thinks that he's the natural leader. He's also, remember, the keeper of the Holy Lance, that miraculous relic that was discovered during the siege of Antioch, which Raymond of Toulouse and some of his followers attribute as the reason for their miraculous escape from Antioch. So he says, I'm the highest born, I'm the wealthiest, I'm the natural leader, and look, I've sort of been privileged by God as the keeper of this miraculous relic. Clearly, I should be in charge of this whole thing. And just in case you're not convinced yet that Raymond was entirely cynical on this score, there's a bizarre twist of events that makes it really clear. So you'll remember that Peter Bartholomew, the peasant who initially came to Raymond of Toulouse and Bishop of Adhemar to tell them about the Holy Lance, was doubted by Bishop Adhemar, right? Bishop Adhemar, the churchman, he was skeptical about this. Well, in late August, Bishop Adhemar unfortunately died of a disease, so he's out of the picture. And now Peter Bartholomew, the same peasant who brought the news of the Holy Lance, and now spends a lot of time hanging out with Raymond of Toulouse, begins to have new visions, in which he sees Bishop Adhemar, who's dead, remember, okay? Bishop Adhemar is dead. Peter Bartholomew says, "Ah, yes, Bishop Adhemar came to me in my vision. He spoke to me from purgatory, and he showed me that he had been beaten and burned as punishment for his failure to believe in the Holy Lance, for his sinful doubt." And so, in this amazing way, Peter Bartholomew begins to ventriloquize the voice of Bishop Adhemar from beyond the grave, who's now a very different Bishop Adhemar, saying exactly the opposite of the things that Bishop Adhemar said in his lifetime. In his lifetime, Bishop Adhemar was doubtful about this lance business. After death, he becomes a very strong voice, encouraging other people not to follow his sinful path of doubt, but to embrace the authenticity of the Holy Lance, and of course the blessed status of Raymond of Toulouse, who has been chosen by God to bear the Holy Lance. You see how this is going? So Peter Bartholomew's status begins to dramatically increase. He's sort of this populist folk hero, and in some ways, he's stepping into the position that Bishop Adhemar left vacant. Bishop Adhemar was this very respected churchman. He was a high-ranking church official. He was someone that many of the leaders sort of deferred to as a spiritual authority. He's dead. So there's a vacuum here, and this peasant, who's easily manipulated by Raymond of Toulouse, wants to step into that position as the sort of spiritual or moral authority of the Crusading army and the voice of spiritual guidance. And so a lot of people are willing to listen to Peter Bartholomew because of the miraculous escape from Antioch. And they say, we all thought we were goners. There was no way we were going to get out of there alive. And we did. Maybe it really was the power of this miraculous Holy Lance and this miracle that Peter Bartholomew brought to us. So we're going to listen when Peter Bartholomew tells us about his other visions. I mean, this could be really critical to our survival. So Peter Bartholomew gets this large following. And the more people that are listening to him, the more inflated his sense of self-importance becomes. And pretty soon he's making some very wild pronouncements. We're going to come back to Peter Bartholomew very soon, but we need to pan out and look at the rest of the army here, because while Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond are once again fighting, now inside Marat, for position, the army is getting really very hungry again. So as December 1098 slips into January 1099. They've now been inside this city for more than a month, and supply lines have fallen apart. So they've essentially exhausted the food supplies that were available in the city, but there's no new food coming in. So that means that once again, there are shortages. By the time we get to January 1099, many of the men in the army are beginning to have this horrifying sense of déjà vu. Once again, food is short, they're malnourished, they're beginning to starve, and why are they stuck here anyway? It's because these nobles are still fighting and we're still staying here. You can imagine the anger that this would have caused. So some horrifying stories now begin to emerge. The poorer members of the Crusading army, who didn't have the money to purchase food from wherever it might be acquired, now resort to some very desperate measures. One source that was embedded with the Crusading army says the following: "The poorer members of the army, now entirely destitute and without means to ease their hunger, desperate for money, ripped open the bodies of the dead Muslims, hoping to find coins in their entrails, which had occasionally happened in the past. Why would there be coins in the entrails? Because if you were in a city that was about to be overrun by an opposing army, you knew that those people were going to pillage the city, which means they were going to take any wealth they could get their hands on. So sometimes, if you had something like a jewel or a gold coin, you would swallow it, so it would be hidden from soldiers who were seizing things, and then hopefully evacuate your body some days later when, if you were still alive, you could wash it off and keep it. So as desperation, there were some people who did this, and because stories of this were in circulation, we now see some of these crusading soldiers cutting open corpses, hoping to find bits of money that they might use to purchase food. It doesn't stop there. Others cut chunks of flesh from the buttocks of dead Saracens, which they cooked to eat, but were so hungry that they started eating it while it was still half raw, unquote. Another account from the Crusade says that men were driven so to desperation by hunger that they retrieved Muslim bodies they'd thrown into a nearby swamp 3 weeks ago, which was when they'd taken the city at the beginning of December. They pull these bodies up and they start cutting chunks off to eat them. Now, these sources are not things that were written 50, 60, or 100 years later. These accounts were written by men who were part of the Crusading army. They were there. And these are things that they say happened amongst people that they knew or they saw with their own eyes. Frankish chronicler Radulf of Cayenne writes that, quote, "In Marat, our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled," unquote. Now, he's not saying that they were boiled or impaled while alive. The idea was that most of these people, these Muslims, they're sometimes called pagans, Muslims, Saracens, same people. These are just different terms that the crusading sources use. They would have been butchered at the time that the city was overrun. And then we're talking about this grisly activity of cooking and eating bodies that are dead. The cannibalism at Marat is further reported in an official letter to the Pope, which says, quote, "A terrible famine racked the army at Marat and placed it in the cruel necessity of feeding itself upon the bodies of the Saracens," unquote. But the Marat incident is not the first time we've seen cannibalism reported. If you listen to our last episode, you'll remember that outside the walls of Antioch, the Crusaders seized a man that they thought was a spy. They killed him, and they roasted him, and then they ate his flesh very publicly, and they said this was a warning to other would-be spies. So we already have other accounts of Franks or Crusaders, Western Knights, doing this kind of thing. And the Crusaders themselves report it. So this is not some kind of dubious propaganda that's being spread by the other side, just by Muslims saying, oh, those savages, imagine all the horrendous things they did. They ate people, they put babies on pikes, they did all these things. The Crusaders themselves say, we did these things. So both sides report it, the Muslim sources as well. And of course, for Muslims, when they heard of these things or saw these things, word spread very quickly that these barbarians from the West are absolute animals. They fight with great savagery, but they have no civilization, they have no decency, they stop at nothing, they eat human flesh. So once again, it's not in question that cannibalism did happen on the First Crusade. The only question is why? Most of the crusading sources say we were in extreme conditions. We were starving. We did it as an act of desperation. And that's certainly what they wrote to the Pope. There were some reports later. Some of the Muslim reports, for example, say that there were some crusaders who seemed to be doing this as an act of psychological warfare, that they would declare their intention to do this, that they would do it visibly, that they were doing it deliberately to terrify the people in the surrounding countryside. This may be true, We don't know. If you were going to write home about terrible things your army did as a crusader, you probably wouldn't say, yeah, we thought it was a really good idea, as a psychological warfare tactic to be seen eating human arms and legs in public. You would say, we only did this when we were absolutely desperate. So where is the truth in all this? It's hard to say. Certainly there was extreme hunger, both in front of Antioch and at Marat. Later Crusader sources, not the eyewitnesses at the time, but ones that were writing 80 years, 100 years later, begin to spin this cannibalism story. And they say, oh, there was just a group of Crusaders. They were called Taffers. They were very, very poor. They'd taken vows of poverty. They followed this one guy who was kind of insane. They didn't wear shoes. They were kind of like wild beasts. And the leaders of the Crusading army didn't really have any control over them, and they were the ones that ate human flesh. Nobody else did. Just this one group of really sort of deranged, poor, savage guys. Which sounds a lot like what the Muslims said, doesn't it? But when the Crusaders said this, it was a way of sort of compartmentalizing blame and saying, it wasn't most of us, just this particular specific division of guys, and we have a special name for them, and they were over there by themselves. They were savages, and we didn't do anything like that. But it takes a long time for that version of the story to develop. At the time, the sources that were writing when this was happening didn't make those distinctions, suggesting that it was more widespread than perhaps some people would like us to believe. Clearly, the army needs to move out of Marat immediately and start seeking food. So, under enormous pressure from his followers, Raymond of Toulouse has to make a decision. Is he going to stay in Marat and fight and say he gets control of this town? Or is he going to try to lead the army toward Jerusalem and establish himself as the leader of that mission? Is he going to pursue a strategy of local control, building his own petty kingdom, or is he going to try and put himself at the head of a moving force? Raymond of Toulouse makes the second decision. So on January 13th, after raiding local areas to acquire whatever supplies are available, Raymond of Toulouse leads his men, which is not the entire Crusading army, but the men who are willing to follow him, he leads out of Marat, which is a ruin of what it once was, behind him. And they do this in a kind of religious procession with hymns and prayers, and onward they go, taking the road once again in the direction of Jerusalem. Raymond is not in any hurry. Once again, this is a desperately needed feeding walk. So he and his men are going very slowly across the landscape, and in some ways they're benefiting from the things that happened in Marat and Antioch, because many of the towns and cities in the region have heard of what's happened to the population of those two cities. They've heard about the cannibalism. They've heard about the absolute devastation and ruin, and they say, we don't want these guys outside our gates. So anything we can do, any protection money or payoff that we need to send is worth it, so that we can all survive until these crazy foreigners leave our lands and we can go back to living like normal people. So what happens is that Raymond of Toulouse and his men begin receiving delegations from Muslims in the local area saying, here, we've come bringing you gifts. Here's some gold. Here's some horses. Please have this and pass by our town and don't stop, okay? That's the deal. Have this stuff and please continue on your way. We wish you a quick passage through these lands. And so in some ways they're beginning to profit from this, and so they're not in any hurry. They're thinking, well, let's just continue nice and slowly and get as much of this sort of booty and bonus as people are going to shower on us as we make our slow way along. Raymond also wants to buy time, because he's set off in the direction of Jerusalem, but the number of men following him are not enough to take the city, far too few. So he's kind of hoping that as he's started the momentum on the road, that the other divisions of the Crusading army will make up their minds to follow him, and they will leave Marat or Antioch or wherever they are and follow him, rejoin his forces so that he'll have a much larger group. So in order to buy time for this to happen, he decides, you know what, this whole besieging of local towns and cities seems to be going really well. It seems to be a very lucrative operation. So I'm going to pick another city. It's called Arca. and I'm going to array my men around that city. We're going to put it under siege and camp out here for a while, hopefully receiving more support from others in the local area, and give the other crusading divisions time to catch up with us. It's important to note here that Arca is not a city that the emperor has told Raymond of Toulouse or the Crusaders to take. At this point, these guys are freelancing. They're picking targets that they think are lucrative for them, and they're taking them because they think it's a good business proposition. So Raymond is doing this on his own initiative, and he's going to be occupied in front of this city for several months. Now, it's in this period that the affair of the Holy Lance comes to an end point. And I have to pause and include this story because it is so quintessentially medieval. It's something that sort of encapsulates all of the things you've heard about people in the Middle Ages. So here we go. So you'll remember that Peter Bartholomew, the peasant who had initially discovered the Holy Lance, had become something of a popular religious leader. And his visions and his pronouncements were getting increasingly wild, and he was sort of drunk on his own recent celebrity. So now he comes up with a really bizarre statement. The army, Raymond of Toulouse and the guys who are following him, including Peter Bartholomew, who stays very close to his noble patron, Raymond of Toulouse, they're camped outside Arca, and Peter Bartholomew says, "I've received a vision. There are sinners in the army, sinners who are causing God to be displeased with us. And the only way that we can have victory is for these sinners to be identified and eliminated. And I've had this vision. If we just line up the army in several ranks, I will go through and I'll be able to identify the sinners. And the Lord has told me that it's His will that I supervise the immediate execution of these sinners." And suddenly the guys in the army are like, "Wait, what? What? You want us to line up so that you're just randomly going to point people out and those guys are going to die based on your say-so? What kind of a game is this?" So he's finally gone too far. And at this point, many people who've been embedded in the army, who've sort of been privately doubtful about Peter Bartholomew and thought he was a bit of a fraud, but had been too afraid to speak up publicly because he was so popular. Now some of these guys come to the forefront and say, "This is just crazy. This is garbage. You are a fraud and the things you're saying are not true. We don't want to submit to this. You're a liar." So now Peter Bartholomew's entire authority is being challenged. And of course, he links his authority to the authenticity of the Holy Lance. That's the basis for everything. He's the one who found or reported the existence of the Holy Lance, and that's the basis for his entire status. So if the Holy Lance is true, then he, Peter Bartholomew, is not a fraudster, but really a messenger from God. So Peter Bartholomew says, no, I am God's messenger. The Holy Lance is a real relic. Everything I've said is true, and I am willing to prove it to you. I'm going to go through trial by ordeal. So this idea of trial by ordeal is a very medieval thing. There was also trial by combat, which is the other version, but we're not going to talk about that here. Trial by ordeal was something that was offered when a person's oath or character was suspect. But we need to know the truth of what that person is saying. So we're not sure we can trust them just because they've said it. So we need some other way of verifying their report. And trial by ordeal would basically be some form of physical injury. Sometimes the person undergoing the trial would be holding a red-hot iron or submerging part of their body in boiling water. There were many variations of this. Some people have reported that you were expected to have no injuries if you were truthful and passed the trial by ordeal, but that's not the case. It seems that medieval people knew everyone was going to be injured during this kind of a thing. The question was what happened after you were injured. So you would be injured if you were going to hold a red-hot iron, for example. You would finish the ordeal, you'd put it down, your hands would be burned, and they would wrap your hands, they would dress the wound, and they would wait. If your wounds festered, then that was a sign that you were a liar. And the festering would probably kill you anyway, but if it didn't, then you would suffer whatever penalty you was due for being a liar. But if the wound healed cleanly without festering, then you had told the truth. So this is essentially what Peter Bartholomew is offering to do. He's saying, I believe I'm God's messenger and I will prove it to you. Give me a trial by ordeal, and the truth of my words will be proved upon my body. Now, given the stakes that were at play here for Peter Bartholomew being found truthful, the Crusaders created a particularly arduous trial by ordeal. The reports are that they assembled piles of olive branches, some 4 feet high, 13 feet long, and only 1 foot apart. So what you're going to have here is basically 2 giant piles of olive branches, and there's a very, very narrow road between them. Now, in preparation for this trial by ordeal, Peter Bartholomew fasted and prayed for several days, which was customary to sort of purify your soul and make sure that you were in the best possible spiritual condition to undergo this test. And then on the appointed day, he appeared before the assembled troops wearing a simple garment and holding the fragment of the Holy Lance in his hand. The piles of olive branches that I've already mentioned were then set on fire and coaxed into a roaring blaze. And it was at this point that the trial would begin. Peter Bartholomew would have to pass between these 2 walls of fire. Remember, there's only about 1 foot between them. So if you think about how wide that is, Peter Bartholomew is going to have to go in sideways, right? With fire 4 feet high in front of him and behind him. So he takes a deep breath, he starts saying his prayers, he walks into the wall of fire, and he continues going until he emerges out the other end. Now, what happens when he emerges from this fiery inferno varies depending on the reports that you read. There are some nobles who were very, very devoted to the cult of the Holy Lance and its authenticity, because they started monasteries and shrines to it back in Europe when they got home. So they're very invested in Peter Bartholomew being correct, who say that Peter Bartholomew emerges at the other end, shrieking, "God help us," and is then mobbed by an enthusiastic crowd and very seriously injured during that mobbing. Now you might be wondering, why would people mob a guy who just came out of a fiery inferno? Well, if you believed that Peter Bartholomew was the messenger of God and had just miraculously passed through the flames, then you would be very interested in getting perhaps a piece of his garment or some of his hair or something that had contacted him physically, because that would also contain some of his spiritual power. So the devotees of the Holy Lance say, Peter Bartholomew was badly injured when he got out of the flames. But other people who were there at the time say, he came out of the flames exactly as you'd expect, very badly burned. What all the sources agree on is that Peter Bartholomew died as a result of his injuries a few days later. And the fact that he died meant for most of the men who were with Raymond of Toulouse at this time, the cult of the Holy Lance was over. Its messenger had been proved to be a fraud, and therefore the lance itself probably didn't have any special power, and guess what? Raymond of Toulouse didn't have any special status for being the keeper of the Holy Lance either. So Peter Bartholomew's death leads to a fairly spectacular collapse in the devotees around the Holy Lance and the status that it confers, including the belief in the victory that it's supposed to provide. There were some men who continued to believe in this miracle, but at this point they were by far the minority. The result of this for Raymond of Toulouse is that his bid to be the undisputed leader of the Crusade is significantly weakened. He does manage, however, to draw several other Crusader divisions to him as he's left Marat, heading for Jerusalem, because he writes to them and says, "Oh no, there's another Seljuk Turkish army that's going to close in. We desperately need you guys to help us out if we're going to survive. Please come." So he does succeed in attracting a larger force as he continues to make his way toward the Holy City. Significantly, though, Bohemond the Norman, the military genius of the expedition, does not join the men who are now heading to Jerusalem. Bohemond remains in Antioch, which he has decided is going to be his, because he has a longer-term vision for what he's doing in this part of the world, and going to Jerusalem is no longer his biggest priority, if indeed it ever was. It was June the 7th, in 1099, when the Crusading army finally reaches the walls of Jerusalem. So nearly a full year since they've survived Antioch. A year that's led to all kinds of crazy events and starvation and cannibalism and feuding. It must have seemed interminable to many of these men who had sworn that they would reach Jerusalem, but had never imagined it would take quite this long or be perhaps quite as painful as it has been. Jerusalem is a fabled city for the Crusaders, but not only for them. It has been the holy city for all three major monotheistic religions, for Judaism, for Christianity, and for Islam. All of them have stories of their founding figures that are rooted in this city, in its stones. And so it is full of legend and also of places of worship built by all three of these communities over the centuries. It has been under Muslim control for several centuries at this point, but there are Jewish communities living inside the city, there are Eastern Christian communities living inside the city, and there are, of course, Muslim communities who have been living in the city for a very long time. The Crusading army that now approaches its gates is less than half of its original size. They've seen many of their brethren succumb to disease, fall in battle, die of starvation, and for many of them it must have seemed that this moment was almost impossible. They may have had a sense of disbelief that they're finally at the gates of their destination. They've heard stories of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Jesus' body was laid to rest after he was crucified. They've heard stories of pilgrims who've been coming to this place for generations and have returned with a sense of blessing and an acute sense of history, having touched the very stones and places that were part of the life of Christ himself. And so it's with a sense of awe, with relief, and with wonder that they approach these walls. But perhaps not with a sense of reverence, as you're about to see. And Jerusalem is not going to fall easily into their hands. Remember, it's occupied by the Fatimid army, which has taken it the previous summer, August of 1098. They've kicked out the Seljuk Turks, they've reoccupied this city which has been part of their territory for a long time, and they're not about to give it up to these Western foreigners who, in their view, should never be in this city in the first place. But the Crusaders are so overwhelmed by enthusiasm for finally being at the walls of Jerusalem itself that at first they begin to try and scale the walls and throw themselves at its defenses without much organization and only a few hastily constructed ladders. They've heard that Jerusalem is a place that is so full of divine power that they will have many of their sins washed away just from entering its gates and reaching the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So some of them can hardly wait. But these initial attacks are easily repelled by the well-organized defenders, and the Crusaders realize they're going to have to step back. They're going to have to take some time and build the necessary siege machines that they will require in order to get through the heavily fortified walls of this ancient city. Of course, this process is going to take time and timber. And furthermore, they're going to be facing some difficulties because the defenders of Jerusalem have heard that they're coming and they've made preparations. They've poisoned most of the water supply on the plains outside the city. So the army is going to have to make longer and longer trips to the water sources that are farther out that are still drinkable. And of course, those locations are very predictable. So there are going to be ambushes lying in wait for men that come there for water so they can pick off these guys in smaller numbers. And of course, they're going to be dealing with the increasing heat of a Palestinian summer blazing down upon them in their metal chainmail. Meanwhile, as the Crusaders are worried about logistics, getting water, finding timber to build these siege machines, they're also trying to intimidate the defenders of the city. So they had managed to capture a Fatimid nobleman of some kind, and by all reports, he was an elderly gentleman, someone of very noble bearing. He was rich, he was cultured, and he attracted a good deal of interest from some of the leaders of the crusade. There are reports of these nobles very interested in having conversations with this man, questioning him about his life, his customs, the manners of the cities where he'd grown up, and also encouraging him to convert to Christianity. And while this cultured nobleman was willing to engage in conversation with the Crusaders, he was not willing to adopt their religion. He refused this. And so when they realized that they weren't going to get anywhere with this, they decided to make an example of him. So the Crusaders brought this man out in full view of the defenders from their position on the walls of Jerusalem, and they had him beheaded. So then they're waving the severed head around, and they're doing this to taunt the defenders once again and saying, here is one of you, this is what we've done to him, this is the fate that awaits all of you guys. But it wasn't until mid-July of 1099 that the Crusaders had made the necessary preparations, the siege towers, the battering ram that they were going to need to finally begin their sustained assault on the walls of Jerusalem. And the morning of July 14th, 1099, when the attack was going to commence, began with a terrible surprise for the defenders of the city. For weeks, the Fatimid defending forces had been watching the Crusaders busily at work constructing a multi-story siege tower. This was a standard tool of medieval warfare, so the siege tower provided a covered structure to transport men close enough to the wall that you could then lower some sort of drawbridge or ladder to allow them to cross over to the wall itself and begin the invasion of the city from the inside. So for the last few weeks, the Crusaders had been building this multi-level structure next to the part of the wall that it seems they intend to attack. And the Fatimid defenders had responded very rationally. They had begun to move their defense machines, their stone-throwing devices, closer to that area, massing their defending troops closer to that area because this is where they anticipated there would be a major push of invaders. But on the morning of July 14th, as the trumpets sound and the Fatimids go to their positions, the tower has disappeared. It's vanished. And it's reappeared about a kilometer away at another section of the wall. So the Crusaders had worked frantically all night, disassembling the almost completed tower that they had built and reassembling at a different place. So some guys hadn't slept. They'd been busy doing this very difficult, very heavy work at top speed. But the purpose of this was to trick the defenders into moving many of their machines and all of their guys into the wrong spot. And now that they've woken up, the place that those resources are going to be needed is actually somewhere else. And there's no way that they can maneuver all of their men and materials fast enough to reach the place where they're actually going to be facing the assault. So the battle begins with the siege tower at this new location, and the Crusaders simultaneously attacking another location on the wall. And the purpose of this is to spread out the resources of the defenders so they have to fight on both fronts. Crusader sources report that the Fatimid defenders resisted them with astonishing courage, hurling fire and stones in all directions. At one point, the Crusaders were pushing another large siege tower toward the wall, and the report is that it was 3 stories high. It was full of men. So you can imagine trying to push this wooden structure slowly across the ground, how heavy it's going to be when it's 3 stories full of soldiers in it. And the whole game is that the defenders on the wall are trying to take this tower out before it gets close enough to the wall. So they're using mangonels, essentially a type of a catapult that throws a rock like a sling on a stick. So it really extends the range and the speed at which that projectile is going to be launched. And mangonels are great, but the problem is you have to set them to a certain range. And so as the siege tower is crossing through the firing zone of the mangonels, they're trying to get through it intact. And if they can get through that circle, they're now inside the range. So actually safe from the mangonels. They cannot adjust the range of these machines very quickly. So if they get past mangonel firing range, they're now inside. And now they're going to be dealing with shorter range attacks, arrows, shorter range slings, and this kind of thing. So it's this awful race as the guys pushing the siege tower are trundling through the mangonel drop zone, trying to get through it fast enough so that they can now approach the wall. And of course, they're just being pelted with everything that defenders can muster. And the damage inflicted by some of these projectiles is horrifying. We have an eyewitness report of this. As machines of war came close to the walls, defenders rained down upon the Christians stones, arrows, flaming wood and straw, and threw mallets of wood wrapped with ignited pitch, wax, and sulfur, and rags on the machines. These mallets were fastened with nails so that they stuck in whatever part they hit and then burned. These projectiles kindled fires which held back those whom swords, high walls, and deep ditches had not disconcerted." Unquote. Now, of course, guys in siege towers were aware that they would be dealing with flaming projectiles and sometimes flaming liquids. So the standard technique would be to try and cover your siege tower with leather, especially wet skins, something that wouldn't catch on fire easily, so that hopefully the flaming projectile would hit that surface and sort of slide off without reaching the wooden structure underneath and lighting it up. So this is the kind of stuff that they're dealing with as they're inside the tower getting closer to the wall. Now, at one point, we get an eyewitness report of the sickening damage inflicted by a stone projectile that did manage to take out one of the men in the top floor of the siege tower. So this particular soldier was standing next to one of the leaders of the crusade, a guy called Godfrey of Bouillon. Quote, "A stone flying randomly hit a certain soldier who was standing at Godfrey's side hard on the head. His skull was broken and his neck shattered, and he was killed instantly. The Duke, who had narrowly missed so sudden a blow, fought back hard with his crossbow against those manning the mangonels." Unquote. So you can imagine these guys on the top floor of the tower getting closer and closer. Flaming objects are coming their way. Stones are taking out in dramatic, explosive fashion the guys standing next to them. And the guys on the top floor are frantically firing with their crossbows at the defenders on the wall, trying to take out some of the men who are in charge of hurling these projectiles. The fighting went on all that day and into the next. It was only on July 15th, 1099, that the Crusaders finally succeeded in scaling the walls and getting their men on the inside of the defensive perimeter of Jerusalem. And once this happened, reports are that the defenders got terrified and began to run. They'd heard all these horrifying stories of the barbaric Franks, their extreme brutality, their cannibalism, their savagery. They'd focused all of their attention on preventing these guys from getting inside the walls, but once they began to see that the first Crusaders had gotten inside, a lot of the resistance crumbled, which allowed the Crusaders to rapidly flood in and take control of the city. What followed next is grievous and disturbing to report. One Crusader who was there, by the name of Raymond of Aguilera, says this, quote, "With the fall of Jerusalem and its towers, one could see marvelous works. Some of the pagans were mercifully beheaded. Others, pierced by arrows, plunged from towers. And yet others, tortured for a long time, were burned to death in searing flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet lay in the houses and streets, and men and knights were running to and fro over corpses." Unquote. Now, the sacking of a city after a siege very often involved the killing of many of the inhabitants. If a city under siege surrendered, sometimes terms of surrender could be negotiated, which didn't involve this horrifying part of the process. But if a city was taken during a siege, if it was taken by force, then this kind of mass movement of soldiers flooding through the city, taking whatever they could, and killing, raping, and torturing the inhabitants is widely reported. This was something that happened in medieval warfare, but what happens in Jerusalem seems to be a few degrees worse than even the level of terrifying that usually happened in medieval sieges. Another Crusader source reports, quote, "They were stabbing women who had fled into palaces and dwellings, seizing infants by the soles of their feet from their mothers' laps or their cradles, and dashing them against the walls and breaking their necks. They were slaughtering some with weapons, striking them down with stones," unquote. While there are various accounts of the casualties that were inflicted during the sack of Jerusalem, no one was making a very accurate count of the enormous number of bodies that were so rapidly piling up. All accounts agree that almost all of the Muslim population of the city was slaughtered, saving only a very few number of Muslim soldiers who had surrendered to a particular crusader and were given passage out of the city in return. Apart from those guys, it seems that almost everyone else, if they were Muslim, they were killed. As for the Jewish inhabitants of the city, they were also cut down and slaughtered in the streets of the section of the city where they lived, and a very large number of them fled into their synagogue, and the Crusaders surrounded the synagogue and set it on fire, burning all of the inhabitants alive. This process of the torture, the slaughter, and the theft that the Crusaders are going to inflict on the population of Jerusalem goes on for more than a week. And you have to imagine people who are terrified. They're trying to find places to hide. They're trying to find corners where they can conceal themselves and try to survive this massacre. It was a horrific scene. Very soon, as the bodies begin to pile up, the Crusaders decide we better start moving these corpses out. This is hot summer weather, remember? These things are going to start putrefying. There are thousands of corpses. This is going to be the cause of a lot of smell and a lot of disease. So very soon there are the flames of piles of corpses that are being burned in various parts of the city as well. Now, you might think that the Crusaders were doing bad things to the Muslim inhabitants of the city and also to the Jewish inhabitants of the city, but surely they treated the Christians well, right? I mean, after all, they were there to liberate Eastern Christians in Jerusalem from the control of Seljuk Muslims, right? Well, the Christians didn't do very well either. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as I've already said, was perhaps the holiest site for Christians in Jerusalem. And at the time that the Crusaders entered, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had a number of Eastern Christian priests from a variety of communities. There were Armenian Christians, Syrian Christians, Coptic Christians, Georgian Christians. And these priests had shared access to that church, and they shared officiation rights. So they were all part of their own very old, very historic Christian communities, far older than the Latin Christian communities of the West. And this church was part of their patrimony, part of their heritage, part of their history. The Crusaders who come in to this church are all Latin Christians. So they follow the Pope, and they've been disconnected from their Eastern Christian brethren for some time now. And they say, all these Eastern priests, out. We control this church now. We're going to have a Latin priest in charge of this. And then they demand that the Eastern Christian community leaders tell them where is the holiest relic in all of Jerusalem, the section of the true cross, which is apparently preserved there somewhere. What is the true cross, you might be wondering? Well, it's supposed to be the cross on which Jesus Christ himself was crucified. So the entire cross hasn't survived, but stories are that some section of it has been preserved, and is in this church or nearby somewhere in Jerusalem. The Eastern Christian priests, somewhat outraged at having been kicked out of their own church, say, no, actually, we're not going to tell you where that is. We're not telling you anything. And so the Crusaders round up some of these guys and they torture them until they do get the information that they require. So this orgy of murder, theft, rape, torture, all of these horrible things in Jerusalem, it's going on for about a week. And at the end of that time, the Crusaders, now having established some kind of order, having looted all of the valuables out of the mosque of the Dome of the Rock, having kicked the Eastern priests out of their own Christian church and tortured them until they got the relic they wanted, having pushed corpses into piles and begun to organize their burning, now have a sense of gratitude and jubilation. With their clothes stained with blood, their bags swollen with the amount of loot that they've acquired, having stolen all of the valuables out of the Mosque of the Dome of the Rock, having kicked the Eastern Christians out of their church, the Crusaders flood into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, now under Latin Christian control, and they want to offer prayers of devotion and songs of praise to their God. They believe that God has given them this victory and allowed them to fulfill their vows of reaching the holy city of Jerusalem at last. Now this scene, which juxtaposes extreme violence with religious piety in the name of Christianity, may seem bizarre to us. But Oxford historian Thomas Asbridge points out, quote, "In the minds of the Crusaders, religious fervor, barbaric warfare, and a self-serving desire for material gain were not mutually exclusive experiences, but could all exist entwined in the same time and place." Unquote. This was the liberation of Jerusalem that the Crusaders had promised, and the relief for Eastern Christians from the oppression of the Muslim invaders. It seems unlikely that this was what Emperor Alexius Comnenus and Eastern Christians had in mind when the Crusaders were invited over. But this is what they got. As I previously said, Jerusalem is a holy city for all three of the major monotheistic faiths. And Muslims have pointed out in the immediate aftermath of the sack of Jerusalem that they treated the inhabitants of that city very differently when the first Muslims took it in 638 from the control of the Eastern Roman Empire. So 638 is in the very first explosion of Islam across the Arabian Peninsula, the very earliest days under Caliph Omar, who was one of the first successors of Muhammad. And when Muslim forces under Omar surround the city, they basically wait until supplies run out. They are allowed in, and they make a deal with the inhabitants of the city. They say, we're not going to kill you. We're not going to take your possessions. We're going to install a Muslim governor here. This is now going to be part of our territory. But it's basically a changing of the political guard. And they point out that Umar, the leader of the Muslim army, discussed things with the Greek patriarch, the Christian patriarch, the ranking religious authority in the city at the time, with respect, that he unrolled his prayer mat beside the church and not inside it, because he said, my followers will want to build a mosque in this city wherever I put my mat down to pray. So let me not do it inside your church. Let me do it outside your church over here. So these Muslims point out that when we arrived in the holy city, we respected the Jewish traditions. We let Jewish people back into the city. By the way, they weren't there in 638. The Romans had kicked them out. So we let Jews back in. We didn't destroy Christian churches. We didn't loot your holy places. We built ours next to yours. And we let Christian pilgrims come into the city for some 4 centuries. So they point out that this treatment of Jerusalem that the Crusaders inflicted in 1099 wasn't standard. It wasn't necessary. The city had been taken by others before, and this level of violence was entirely egregious. As for the emperor, He had invited the Crusaders in to help him reclaim territory he'd lost to the Seljuk Turks and to take Jerusalem because he knew that would be a politically attractive proposition. But he had now lost control of the Crusading army. They weren't handing back Antioch, they were besieging other cities and towns on their own initiative, and they were no longer on good terms with the emperor. So he must have felt at this point that he had a rogue army running wild across his territory, and who could know where they would go next? Some of the leaders of this Crusading army are now developing an interest in carving out parts of this territory for themselves, setting up their own little kingdoms here in the East. For many Crusaders, the ordinary people, the infantrymen, the backbone of this army, Jerusalem is the end point of their quest, the place where they can finally breathe a sigh of relief and think about turning around and returning home. But in many ways, Jerusalem will be only the beginning. Many more incredible stories will unfold as a result of this episode. Bohemond is going to become a medieval rock star. Crusader kingdoms will be established across the Middle East. And the legend of the First Crusade will be born, a story that will inspire centuries of military expeditions and violence yet to come. But for all of those stories, you'll need to come back for the fourth and final episode on the First Crusade. I hope you've enjoyed this story, and if so, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss the next chapter in this incredible story. And if you've really enjoyed it, please consider heading over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert so that you can become a supporter of the podcast and have access to behind-the-scenes content and live conversations on all things historical. Thank you, and I hope I'll see you in the next episode.